afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's ACC Dallas-Fort Worth webinar. As you've heard, I'm Jasmine Winton, and I'll be joined today by Sean McGowan, one of my partners who works out of our DC office at Thompson, Coburn. And as you've heard, Sean assists clients in the areas of transportation and international trade, which are two areas that are obviously significantly affected by our current supply chain crisis. So like you, I'm looking forward to learning from Sean about the causes of the supply chain crisis, how government and private industry have responded, and what's coming next. So before we get started, I'll help set the scene for what's been happening in this crisis. It really comes down to two unprecedented events converging. The first is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic and the disruptions that it caused in our global workforce, particularly around ports, shipping lines, and manufacturers. And then, as all of us were stuck at home, our purchases of goods went up. And that's what this chart shows. And I know the dates are hard to read, but the low point is in March to April of 2020. And then up goes our consumer spending as we started doing remodeling projects around the house. And we're also setting up home offices, home gyms, and home entertainment systems. Then when we started to bounce back, we didn't have our full workforce or equipment in the right places, so our supply chains were taxed. Despite all these challenges, our message is don't panic, this too shall pass. So before we jump into these issues, maybe we should start at the beginning. What is a supply chain and who's in it?
Thanks, Jasmine, and thanks to everyone joining today. Maersk Line, the largest shipping company in the world, has a straightforward definition of supply chain. A simple, straightforward definition is a supply chain is the movement of materials and information through the logistics process from acquisition of raw materials to delivery to the end user. And there are a whole lot of people in the supply chain, vendors, service providers, and customers. The service provider group is complex and includes international and domestic players. Some of those players are vessel operating common carriers, those VOCCs. These are the people who own and operate the ships. They hold themselves out to the general public to provide transportation by water for compensation. We have non-vessel operating common carriers, NVOCCs. They do not own or operate the ships, but they hold themselves out to the general public to provide transportation by ocean transportation also. And they're a middleman between a shipper and the vessel operating common carriers. NVOCCs are licensed and regulated by the Federal Maritime Commission as ocean transportation intermediaries under the Shipping Act. We also have ocean freight forwarders. They're the people that organize shipments on behalf of shippers. They're also ocean transportation intermediaries, and they're licensed and regulated by the FMC as well. We have customs brokers. They arrange for the payment of tariff duties on imported goods, and they help us clear our goods through customs process. We have marine terminal operators. Those are MTOs. MTOs provide the dock space and terminal facilities where containers are unloaded and loaded. And these marine terminals can be owned and operated by the state port authority or leased out by the state to private entities to run. We also have rail carriers, trucking companies, chassis pool operators. Chassis is the trailer that the shipping container sits on. And we have warehouses, etc. So there are a lot of people involved in the supply chain. Jasmine?
Okay, so those are the players that are in the supply chain. What does a healthy supply chain look like?
Well, a lot of our supply chains generally have been modeled on a just-in-time delivery system. Just-in-time is a way to minimize warehousing space and costs by having your cargo shipped to arrive just in time for its use. And as you can see in this slide, this inventory method depends on extremely reliable transportation. There may be 6 or 7 touch points, transportation touch points to get the goods from raw material form in country 1 to the end user in country 2. And all these can be choke points to the supply chain. So The supply chain can take a few hiccups here and there, but a perfect storm of a pandemic, shutdowns, closures, lack of equipment, the containers and the chassis not being where they're needed, lack of personnel, vendors and truck drivers and warehouse personnel maybe being off, port congestion and high volumes of imports, like Jasmine mentioned before, can send the supply chain off kilter. The international supply chain relies on intermodal transportation, which just means that more than one form of transportation conveyance is used on a shipment. For example, it could go from ship to rail to truck. This slide shows how the healthy intermodal transportation system is supposed to work. Ships offload containers to rail cars or trucks. Rail cars or trucks take containers to inland ports, storage yards, warehouses, factories, stores, airports, and the ports use the intermodal transportation system to keep things moving to and from the ports. And as intricate as that whole system may seem, the international intermodal transportation really revolves around two basic items, the container and the chassis. And the use of standardized shipping containers, sometimes referred to as boxes, well, that all started in the US in the late 1940s and 1950s. They were specifically designed for intermodal freight transport in order to easily go from a ship to a rail car to a truck. And the containers really revolutionized transport service, because they were uniform, they were large, they could hold a lot of goods, they were durable, they were made of steel, and they were stackable like Legos, so it made it easy to transport. And they increased the speed of transport because there was no need to unload and reload in between modes of transportation. And today, the most common sizes of these containers are 20 feet or 40 feet long by 8 feet wide. These are in the industry called TEUs or FEUs, 20-foot equivalent units or 40-foot equivalent units. And they can range up to 53 feet long. And it's estimated that the container trade accounts for about 60% of all trade by value, and that's probably even higher than that. And then we have the second part, which is the chassis. The chassis is the truck trailer that's used to transport containers over the road. Sometimes you'll even see the chassis and containers sitting on top of a rail car. And these chassis are interchangeable for use with any tractor trailer, semi-truck, and container. Jasmine?
Thanks for that overview and the helpful visual, Sean. So we all know that every business entity is governed by regulatory bodies. Which entities are in charge of the various players in the supply chain?
Well, we'll want to take a look at least two real quick. We have a Federal Maritime Commission, or the FMC. The FMC is responsible for regulating the U.S. international ocean transportation system, and it regulates and licenses the ocean transportation intermediaries I was talking about before. Those are the ocean freight forwarders and the NVOCCs. And the FMC's role is to ensure a competitive and reliable international ocean transportation supply system that supports the US economy and protects the public from unfair and deceptive practices. Well, how does it do that? The FMC investigates and rules on complaints regarding rates, charges, and practices of common carriers and the marine terminal operators and ocean transportation intermediaries to determine if there has been any violation of the Shipping Act and any FMC regulations. We also have U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, one of the world's largest law enforcement organizations. CBP is charged with keeping terrorists and other weapons out of the U.S. while facilitating trade. CBP is stationed at our U.S. ports of entry and pre-clearance locations all over the world. and they collect duties and clear goods through US ports. And CBP actually can be a cog in this whole port congestion mess that we have, because containers need to get through ports, and they need to be inspected and cleared by customs before they get through the ports. Jasmine?
Thanks, Sean. So let's zone in on ports. What's going on with ports right now, and where are we seeing that strain on the supply chain in our ports?
This slide actually comes from Politico, and it shows how imported containers are moving through some US ports right now. In part one, you have ships coming into a berth at one of the port's marine terminal facilities. You have cranes removing the containers, and containers are temporarily placed into the container terminal or container yard. I mean, some of them go out immediately, but some usually stay there for maybe a couple of days or two. A free time, what's called free time, that they're not getting charged for being on the port. So they'll stay there for a couple of days to clear customs and get trucks or rail cars lined up to haul the containers away. What used to be a 2-day process, maybe, we're now seeing containers stay on the ports for over 9 days. In part two, if the containers aren't removed from the terminals fast enough, space on the terminals gets too tight, and the vessels get backed up and need to anchor offshore until the container backups on land are cleared up. You add trucking shortages, rail car, shipment congestion, and already full or understaffed cargo owner warehouses, and they can all contribute to the congestion and delays. So part three, what are some of the fixes that are being used to address the backup? Well, I mean, ports are starting to extend hours of operation. Foreign ports are actually open 24/7, but that's generally not the case in the United States. We're moving containers to inland ports by rail and by truck to get them off the port property as fast as possible. And some ports are even considering imposing excessive dwell time fees on ocean carriers as an incentive to have them tell their cargo owners and customers to move the containers off the ports quicker. So in part four, again, we use trucks or rails to try to carry these containers off the ports to inland yards or the cargo owner warehouses. But this last part is being delayed due to overall congestion. So the port issue really boils down to one of congestion. Transportation is all funneled into these hubs of the international supply chain. Approximately 90% of all traded goods are carried on the water. That's 90% of all traded goods carried on the water. The pandemic scaled back or closed ports operations around the world. We had China, Vietnam, EU, a lot of ports closed. We had manufacturing slowing down. Suppliers and manufacturers and retailers were closed due to COVID, all creating a lull in the retrieval of goods from the ports and delay in the return of containers and chassis back to the ports. We had ships and container movements all over the world coming to a halt and slowing down. And that resulted in containers not being where they needed to be. They were left at ports or dropped at warehouses that were closed. Then we start to open back up, but not at full worker capacity, at trucking companies or warehouses or distribution centers. Just not enough workers to move things and not enough room to store things. And we add on top of that we have a huge consumer goods demand in the US that stimulated record imports at the ports. It's estimated that in the last 12 months, there were 15 million more containers traveling to and from the port. And there's just not enough space on the ports to accommodate all those new containers. So we end up having full containers waiting for owners to pick them up at ports, and they're staying on ports longer than the 2 days. They're going into the 9-day area, and sometimes they're even staying for weeks. So we also have shortages of chassis and truck drivers needed to move the containers off ports. So as a result, the ships calling ports have to wait days or weeks to be unloaded. and then loaded again. And all this adds up to major congestion at the ports. So what does this all actually look like? Well, this is a recent picture of the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach. And just for full disclosure, the Port of Los Angeles is a firm client. It's estimated that about 40 to 50% of all US import trade comes through the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach. And it handles about 50% of all US containerized imports from Asia. The port complex has experienced 15 months of record import shipments per month. It's averaging approximately 800,000 TEUs per month. And as of late last week, there were 83 container ships at anchor waiting for unloading. This obviously affects scheduling of ships and the availability of cargo space. And these waits can be up to 16 days in some cases. So when there's nowhere to offload containers and not enough space and not enough chassis or truck drivers, you get congestion problems. Jasmine?
Wow, it's really incredible to see the images of those ships just out at sea waiting to come into the ports and unload. So once unloaded, those containers may leave by train or trucks, but I understand we have some additional challenges on the trucking front. Sean, can you tell us what's going on there?
Sure, we do have additional chassis shortages. Simply not enough chassis located on the ports or in the chassis pools. Those are the areas around the ports that hold and maintain chassis. Just simply not enough chassis to move the current volume of containers. And this actually may get a little worse before it gets better. We already have certain percentage of chassis, maybe up to 10%, that may need maintenance and repair. The FMC has stated that approximately 85% of US chassis market comes from China. And the United States earlier this year imposed extremely high trade remedy duties of 220% on imports of truck chassis originating in China. So that's going to make getting new chassis a bit more difficult in the new year. We also have the steady increase in imports that began in the middle of 2020, coupled with labor shortages at warehouses and cargo handling facilities. There's an unknown number of chassis sitting idle under full or empty containers at retailers, warehouses, or in yards. And there's one report out of Southern California that indicated there are approximately 9,000 empty containers sitting on top of chassis in yards. So all this hampers a trucker's ability to turn around the equipment to carry new containers out of the ports faster. And we can't move much over the road if we don't have enough chassis to do it. And some say that the lack of chassis availability is our biggest problem. We also have a new truck and truck driver shortage. According to the American Trucking Association, trucks move more than 72% of the nation's freight by weight. Trucks are basically computers on wheels, just like cars. And we have a high demand for consumer electronics, plus the supply chain issues that we've had have caused a shortage of semiconductors that are needed for new trucks. It's estimated that a new truck needs about 15 to 35 chips per vehicle. And this is affecting new truck order deliveries. So some new truck deliveries have already been pushed into late 2022 and 2023. And on the driver front, we had a shortage of drivers since before the pandemic. And then when the pandemic hit, we had workforce was letting go. We had a lot of drivers retiring. We had some small trucking companies that closed up shop. There was difficulty in getting new hires trained, and all that leads to a shortage of drivers now. And according to the ATA, the truck driver shortage stands at approximately 80,000 drivers. So basically can't find enough people to do the job. Some say that's quality of life issues. Long haul operators can be away for 200, for weeks at a time, traveling over 250 miles. Young people just may not be too interested in the job, and certainly because there are a lot of other interested industries that are fighting for workers and paying them well. So finally, it's not that easy to ramp up a trucking operation and add capacity. You're setting up a new operation is expensive. You have truck costs, you have insurance costs, training, and it's time consuming. There are also regulatory hoops at the DOT and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration to consider as well. So, and it also takes time and money to train drivers. So all the above leads to increased shipping costs. You can see that the average price to get a container from China to the West Coast was about $1,950 in early 2020 pre-pandemic. And now that price can be as high as $15,000. So this is purely supply and demand. And if the less options that we have for transportation leads to this increased cost. Less ships. A lot of ships were in dry dock during COVID. They limited sailings, or they actually skipped ports, in order to make sure that they remained on schedule to some extent. All this means, limited container space availability. You couple that with less trucks and chassis available, and less drivers, less rail space options, less air cargo options due to either space of the cargo or the type of the cargo. All lead to higher transportation costs across all modes of transportation, really. Jasmine?
Yes, all of us are feeling the effects of those increased shipping costs. So Sean, can you take us through some of the major ways that the federal government has responded?
Sure. It's pretty important to realize, though, that this is going to take a long time to fix. We don't have centralized control in one federal agency or party to do something about all this congestion immediately. Supply chains, for the most part, are run by private industry, so it's going to take a concerted effort by government and industry to fix things. And on that front, the president of the federal government's responses on February 24th. President Biden issued an executive order 14017 on America's supply chains. He ordered a 100-day supply chain review to take a look at supply chain risks and provide recommendations to address the risks in 4 key areas. And those were the semiconductor manufacturing, high capacity batteries, including electric vehicle batteries, rare earth metals, and pharmaceuticals and active pharmaceutical ingredients. On June 8th, President Biden established the Supply Chain Disruptions Task Force. This task force highlighted the risks and vulnerabilities identified by the 100-day report, and a couple of things of interest out of that. In terms of semiconductors, the task force found that, first of all, semiconductors power all of our cell phones, our cars, all our electronics, even our fighter jets. But the task force found that the United States has fallen from 37% of global semiconductor production to just 12% over the last 20 years. And for leading edge logic chips, the US and US allies rely primarily on facilities in Taiwan, which produces 92% of such chips. And the task force concluded that we need to do more about getting our sourcing, additional sourcing abroad, but also more importantly, additional sourcing at home in the US. And there's actually a bill in the House right now that would boost domestic semiconductor manufacturing in the US with $52 billion in assistance. The other interesting note was regarding pharmaceuticals, and the task force found that the United States remains critically dependent on imports for a range of key pharmaceutical products. And about 87% of active pharmaceutical ingredient facilities for making generic drugs are located overseas, which has left our US supply chain of essential medicines pretty vulnerable. So we need to work more on sourcing those items in the US as well. On July 9, the president issued another executive order, 14036, on promoting competition in the American economy. He asked the Federal Maritime Commission to vigorously enforce the Shipping Act prohibition against unjust and unreasonable practices in the context of detention and demurrage charges. Again, the detention is the fee that the owner of the cargo, the goods, pays for the use of the container when it's off the port after free time. And demurrage is the fee that the owner of the goods pays for the use of the container on the port after free time expires. And then on October 13th, President Biden gave his remarks on efforts to address global transportation supply chain bottlenecks. This was the commitment by the Port of Los Angeles Long Beach, the Longshoremen's Union, and the Railroad Union at the port to be open 24/7. And this was the first key step toward moving the entire freight transportation and supply chain to a 24/7 system. On November 5th, the $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed. Port and road infrastructure has been an issue for a long time. Earlier in this year, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave the US infrastructure system a score of C-. So this bill will make the biggest investment in ports and waterways in our history. It's $17 billion over the next 5 years for ports and waterways. It also includes $110 billion for roads and bridges and things like that. President Biden just signed this into law yesterday, and he also established a new infrastructure task force to guide the rollout of the funding package. On November 9th, President Biden announced his port action plan. In the next 45 days, there will be awards of $243 million in new port infrastructure grants. And in the next 60 days, projects for the US Army Corps of Engineers construction at coastal ports and inland waterways are to be identified. On November 17th, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is planning a hearing on freight challenges tomorrow. And they're going to be looking into allegations that ocean carriers have actually found it more lucrative to send empty containers back to Asia rather than using them for exports from the United States of US goods, because there's a shortage of boxes and there's a more demand for imports from Asia. Jasmine?
Thanks, Sean, for that summary. So we'll be watching those developments as they continue. So can you tell us now how the rest of the industry has responded to the crisis?
Sure. Let's look at Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach as an example. Again, we have the announcement with President Biden that they're going to be open 24/7. Port's also looking into lifting terminal charges on nighttime container moves between 6 p.m. and 7 a.m. on weekdays and weekends. This is an incentive to get drivers to use the ports during these hours. Beginning November 15th, yesterday, the port stated that it would start charging carriers emergency fees of $100 per container, and it would rise in $100 increments each subsequent day thereafter for local delivery containers that remained on the ports for 9 days. This was, a port effort to clear the backlog of containers so vessels can dock and unload. The port announced this, I think, back in October 25th or so, that they were going to start implementing this plan on November 15th. But the port also has discretion to delay the collection of the fees if they see that there's progress being made on the container movement from the terminals. And, it already appears to be working since that October 25th, publication. The containers at Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach are down a bit. The dwelling containers are down 26% apparently. So as a result, the port announced a delay in the collection of the fee for another week until November 22nd. The ports are also looking for, ways to stack the containers. They're now stacking containers 4 and 5 high. They used to be only allowed to do it 2 containers high. Port of Long Beach has designated additional 64-acre lots for staging areas for containers, and Port of Long Beach is also working with Union Pacific Rail for congestion relief via the Utah inland ports in an effort to reduce the need to ship freight via truck. Georgia Ports Authority, Port of Savannah is considering $600 million expansion. They're extending their storage yards too. They have an 80-acre storage yard. They're looking for more warehouse space. They're shipping things out by rail as well. And they're also increasing their terminal gate hours, not 24/7, but I think they're doing it from 7 to 11 p.m. additional hours. Georgia Ports Authority has also been allowed to use $8 million of federal grant money towards 5 pop-up container yards in Georgia and North Carolina to relieve the congestion, the container congestion. And it's also looking to reopen some closed terminals near Atlanta so cargo owners can have a choice to pick up their containers there if they want. The FMC's response, Federal Maritime Commission, is also concerned with the detention and demurrage issues. In May of 2020, the FMC published a final interpretive rule on the reasonableness of ocean carrier and MTO detention and demurrage practices, saying that storage fees that do not incentivize the retrieval of cargo and return of equipment would be considered unreasonable. In June of 21, FMC has fact-finding 29, the FMC investigating ocean carriers calling at the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach or the Port of New York and New Jersey, looking into determine if their policies and practices related to detention and demurrage, container returns, and container availability for the U.S. export cargoes violate any general prohibitions of the Shipping Act. In July of 21, in response to the President's July executive order on promoting competition in the American economy, FMC established a vessel operating common carrier audit program to assess the top 9 carriers' compliance with agency's rule on reasonableness of detention and demurrage charges by carriers. And that actually resulted in a correspondence being sent to the industry urging carriers to display detention and demurrage charges clearly and prominently on their web pages and clearly delineate dispute resolution procedures, contacts, and required documentation on their website. In September of 21, FMC stated it will issue guidance on complaint proceedings and seek comments on demurrage and detention billings from the public. There have also been various state responses. Just going to mention a couple of states. California, Governor Newsom executive order directed the states to find any kind of state, federal, and private land that was available for short-term container usage. It also asked the states to find additional truck routes to use that may require weight exemptions from the state in order for the truck drivers to use them. The idea of putting as many trucks on the roads as possible to ease the congestion. California State Transportation Agency and the U.S. Department of Transportation said they've partnered on emerging projects as well. It will give California access to billions of dollars in loans from the U.S. Department of Transportation to upgrade ports, rail yards, and supporting infrastructure. In Texas, Governor Abbott launched the Escape California Twitter campaign on November 4th. The video tells carriers that in less than 2 weeks, they can reroute their cargo to one of the 24/7 functioning Texas cargo ports. As part of that Port of Los Angeles open 24/7 announcement, we have Walmart, our nation's largest retailer. They're committing to moving products from the ports to their stores nationwide. They're committing to that 24/7 timeframe. Target, Home Depot, and Samsung have all committed to ramp up their receiving activities during off-peak hours. And FedEx and UPS all committed to significantly increase the amount of goods they're moving at night as well. It's estimated that FedEx and UPS move up to 40% of the packages in the United States. Carrier responses, Mediterranean Shipping Company and Ocean Network Express plan to bring additional vessel services to the Port of Oakland this month. Maersk announced the purchase of Senator International Air Cargo and the addition of I think there were 5 Boeing aircraft to expand air cargo operations. And we also have sweeper ships. In March 2020, when the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach was experiencing a growing empty container problem, MSC sent 23,000 TEU vessels to Southern California to pick up empty boxes. News articles are indicating that carriers are looking to send additional sweeper ships as a good option for clearing port congestion. Rail responses, or rail carriers, are working to move containers off ports and to inland terminals as quickly as possible. There are reports that congestion has eased at key railroad terminals in Chicago, Memphis, Kansas City, and Dallas. Apparently, railroads are no longer limiting container shipments traveling by rail to the West Coast. They have been doing that to limit the number of containers clogging up the West Coast ports. Some rail carriers are offering incentives for bringing in containers to terminals on the weekends as opposed to high traffic weekdays. And some rail carriers are offering incentives for decreasing demurrage and detention storage fees. Next slide. The trucking response, well, there are reports that some companies are offering drivers in the LA area signing bonuses of $5,000. Some companies are increasing employee referral and finder fees. And the American Trucking Association is backing legislation to lower the age of drivers of tractor trailers interstate from 21 to 18. And the president's infrastructure bill will establish a pilot program for the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration to allow 18 to 21-year-old drivers to participate in interstate commerce apprenticeship programs. The infrastructure bill will also establish a women in trucking task force to look at increasing the number of women entering into the trucking industry. I think the statistic now is that there are something like only 6% of the trucking industry is, women are involved. Jasmine?
Thanks, Sean. That was a really great overview of how all the parts of the supply chain have responded to these challenges so far. So Sean, it's time to pull out your crystal ball and look into the future for us. How long will these challenges continue and what's coming next?
How long will this last? That's the magic question, of course. We're hopeful for significant changes in the next 6 to 9 months if no additional COVID variants pop up here or there, abroad. But there are several people that are a little more skeptical and say this will go through next year and possibly into 2023. The holiday season is a huge stressor on the supply chain. Ports continue to be inundated by vessel carrying peak season imports from Asia. Once that's over, we hope to see less strain and more movement of container and chassis. Congestion can be alleviated at the ports with 24/7 operations, but it really must have terminal and private industry buy-in and assistance in order for it to work. We're really going to need more companies like Walmarts and the Targets to step up and help do the 24/7 operation to get things moving. We'll see the containers and chassis sitting at retailers and at warehouses will start to move again, hopefully. We'll see warehouses and port workers at higher capacity. We're already starting to see this now. Bottlenecks at ports should lessen as these containers move by rail to inland ports and container yards. definitely seeming like the rail carriers are increasing their transportation of containers off the ports. We'll either pay the higher tariff on the new chassis from China, or we'll resource those chassis from Mexico, Canada, and Vietnam, or we may be forced to do both in order to get the number of chassis that we need. Truck production will hopefully ramp up if semiconductor chips go through, but we need to look at other alternative sources of these chips and increase our own production of these chips in the United States. We expect drivers to be hired. We expect that there will be incentives for signing on, sign-on bonuses and referral bonuses. But again, according to the ATA, American Trucking Association, we still won't have enough drivers, to solve the problem. Jasmine?
Okay, so given that future outlook, what should the folks on the webinar with us today do in response?
Now is the time to focus on the things that you can control. There are no silver bullets here. A lot of this is stuff that we should be thinking about doing right now, like review and reassess our supply chain operations from start to finish. That means taking a look at all the players in your supply chain that we've talked about today. Are there any that you need to reconsider? We just want to be in our most nimble position so that in the future, if there are disruptions, again, we can respond more quickly and efficiently to those disruptions. On the supplier and manufacturer front, how have your suppliers and manufacturers fared during the COVID crisis? Did they bounce back strong? Are they in difficulty? Do you need to diversify to ensure that you have suppliers and manufacturers in other countries other than China? On the transportation front, do you know your transportation supply chain? How much of that do you control versus it being controlled by your supplier or manufacturer? Do you know all the players involved in how your goods get to your door? Specifically, do you know about all of your carriers, brokers, freight forwarders, motor carriers, and how they've withstood this time period? How have they fared? Are they stable or are they in trouble? Do you need to shop around any of those people just in case? What about communication? Have they been in constant communication with you, or are you constantly chasing after them for information? You might want to ask them, what are their plans for 24/7? What are their plans, if another crisis like this happens in the future? And lastly, on transportation, be sure to review those invoices carefully for any additional charges and fees. On the documentation front, you can make sure that you have all your entry documents ready for submission to customers ahead of the actual entry for faster clearance by customs. As most of you probably know, most things clear customs electronically before they even arrive at the port. So a lack of proper documentation can cause holdups and perhaps even inspections. And you definitely want to avoid that if possible. On the warehousing side, is it time to explore other warehousing options and providers? Really dig into whether your warehouses and distribution centers have the personnel to receive, unload, shelve, and pick orders to go back out to customers. Are they considering 24/7 operations? And if so, what effect will that have on your costs? What the management fees that you pay for that operation? Lines of communication. Communicating with people in your supply chain is very important, obviously. These are the people with their ears to the ground and know the community well. You also need to make sure that you're communicating your supply chain status internally too, though, to your receiving and shipping departments, your sales and marketing departments. It's important to manage your company's and your customers' expectations through all of this. Reviewing transportation and warehouse contracts. This year is going to be a tough year. It's going to be all about gaining access because there's limited capacity. And that limited capacity is going to mean limited space on vessels, trucks, and maybe even in warehouses. So, some of the things that you can do is get several transportation quotes, ocean, truck, rail, and warehouse facilities. But, do it in a targeted way, do the research on the entities first, narrow it down to, a few good performers, and then ask for quotes of those particular performers. Ask for lists of potential charges and any fees that may be applying to a move. It's much better to know that list up front than to be surprised at the end of the day. Discuss demurrage and detention issues with these parties and who is responsible and when. Ask if you can cap these fees or extend the free time on container use. Again, a lot of this time will be spent with communication with your party and your supply chain. Annual service contracts and agreements with ocean carriers, if you have them directly. This year, again, carriers will be in the driver's seat because of limited space on ships for a while. And you may have to come up and offer a lot more volume commitment in order to get good contract prices from the carriers. You may not get as much free time this year either. That's because some people say that the extended free time terms in carrier contracts is one of the reasons we have a backlog of import containers clogging up the ports right now in the first place. You can also examine the roles of the OTIs, your ocean transportation intermediaries, your ocean freight forwarders, your non-vessel operating common carriers, your third-party logistics providers. If you don't have any leverage with the vessel operators, maybe you have some leverage with the non-vessel operating common carriers. There are risks, of course, in that it's an indirect relationship to the parties in the logistic chain. You're not directly contracting with the vessel operator. So you may have some difficulty if you have problems or claims, but there are also a great number of benefits on doing so. These entities are usually experts in their field of international logistics. They have consolidated buying power that you don't have. So they get better rates with ocean carriers than you might get on your own. And that's going to be really important for the smaller players out there. But it may also be important for the larger players who want certain trade routes or have an overflow and they have a couple of containers that they need to get somewhere expedited. So use of these smaller NVOCCs may be a good option for you. And of course, a smaller outfit may mean that you have a person who's really looking out for your interests. So that, somebody who's hungry, and that's always a good thing to have on your side. As far as reviewing and understanding other contract clauses, detention demurrage clauses, one thing to look at is looking at your warehouse and 3PL manager contracts. Those contracts usually have key performance indicators, KPIs, where the more, the better they do. If they meet and exceed expectations, they get a higher fee. But consider clauses ensuring that those entities pay or reimburse you after a certain time. If they can't flip containers in time and detention fees pile up. On delay and missed delivery clauses. These are the late charges you incur from your customer because the warehouse 3PL manager can't get goods out fast enough, maybe. Consider adding some clawback provisions on the management fees that your warehouse and 3PL managers are charging you so that you can recoup the penalties that you are incurring from your customers for these delays. Employee pay, this is going to be really important, especially if more and more companies go to 24/7 operations. So take a look at the warehouse 3PL management contracts regarding staffing and the hiring of employees and labor costs. We have scarce workforce, has made hiring very difficult and very expensive. You need to check the clauses regarding staffing, part-time and full-time pay and salaries. You'll want to know if there are any caps on staffing and the staffing expenses. So try to find solutions. If this supply chain has taught us anything so far, we must have alternate plans for these disruptions. And the ways to avoid backlog is through diversity. So on the supply chain side, maybe shorten the supply chain. Perhaps that's easier said than done, but you want to at least try to do it, or maybe partially do it. Look at sourcing raw materials and manufacturing services closer to home if possible. Look to Mexico, Canada, USA. Look in increasing the number of sources for your supplies and components. Don't just rely on that one vendor in China. Diversify. Look to Korea, Japan, Vietnam, EU, Mexico, Canada, United States, etc. And build more lead time into your shipments going forward. This just-in-time may just not be enough. So you can order and ship early. There are reports about Valentine's Day products arriving at the ports right now. If you have longer lead times on your orders, that may improve service levels and costs in this tight market. And look to build more stock into your operations in order for the supply chain to remain fluid at certain times. And port shop. In other words, try to route your goods to terminals that are less crowded. There's a trade-off with this approach in terms of the number of vessels calling the smaller ports and the timing of those vessels. But vessels may also decide to skip your port en route and head to another port instead if they need to make up time for delays. Example of this was in Port of Baltimore. It's been reported that in the last 14 months, 23 container ships have diverted mid-voyage to go to Baltimore because they thought they could get in and out faster than going to some other ports. And retailers and smaller businesses are taking notice of this, and they're looking at other small ports around the country. But if you go that route, you need to do some research. You need to determine if the vessel has skipped your alternate port before, if that's a habit. You need to look to see if there are enough chassis in the area to handle the increased volume. This could be a big deal as we've seen. And one group, the customs broker, is particularly got their ear to the ground, and they may be a valuable party for you to get this kind of information about port skipping or chassis, since they are in the area and would probably know these things best. You may also want to alert customs to the possibility that you're coming into a new port. You may have increased volume, and they may be able to pull capacity from other ports to help clear goods. You may be able to arrange for delivery to an import for customs clearance rather than filing entry in the port of arrival. Like example, if a ship comes into Virginia, containers on a through bill all the way to the port of St. Louis, a container gets put on a rail car and shipped out. Customs is cleared in St. Louis. There are a few hoops that you have to go through, with customs, but you may want to look into this and see if this is a possibility. Lastly, air freight. Is air freight an option for you? This may be a very expensive option, but it could be an option depending on what kind of freight you have and the air cargo capacity that's available. So all these are a few of the things that you can do now while we're waiting for the supply chain crisis to end.
Well, that concludes our webinar for today. Obviously, we could talk to Sean much more about this topic, but please let us know if you have any questions. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.